In 1905, 18 men died playing football. Violence and injury were part of the game's fabric. Games were literally wars. Football games had become arenas for America's youth to exhibit values of strength and manliness. The legacies of their fathers and grandfathers were forever etched on the blood-stained battlefields of the Civil War. For the sons, it was the gridiron. One year after General Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant ended the bloodiest war in American history, students from two northern schools, separated by a mere 16 miles, renewed their rivalry. They would engage in a baseball contest, with the men from Princeton overwhelming Rutgers University, 40-2. The game reflected the growing influence of athletics after the Civil War.
Their fathers, and perhaps for some of them their grandfathers, had been in the Civil War. They had had this kind of manly experience, and many of these young men were looking for something to just show that they were rough, tough, able people.
An imported game from England quickly became popular. It resembled soccer, played on a town green with an inflated animal bladder for a ball. An ill-defined sport with few rules, the matches were mob-like, bloody, often an excuse for men to maim and settle scores.
That is the origin of American football, at places like Yale and Harvard, where there would be the annual game between the freshman and sophomore class. And again, these were bloody events, but not a game the way we think of sports, on a field with very, very set boundaries and rules.
2 years after Princeton defeated Rutgers at baseball, in Ulysses S. Grant's first year as President of the United States, Rutgers asked for a rematch. This time the game was football. The teams agreed to the following rules established by the Rutgers players. 25 to a side. The ball could not be carried. The game began at 3 in the afternoon on November 6, 1869. Rutgers won by 2 goals, 6-4. It would be the first of 2 games played between the schools that year. It was also the last time Rutgers would defeat Princeton for 69 years. The game would catch on quickly in the East. Columbia would join Rutgers and Princeton in intercollegiate play in 1870. By 1872, along with Yale, the 4 schools established a set of rules for their soccer-style game. However, further north, at America's oldest university, Harvard resisted.
Soccer in England was a lower-class plebeian sport, and Harvard considered this beneath their dignity.
Instead, the Crimson learned a rugby-style game from McGill University in 1874. Looking for other competition, the following year, Harvard captain William Whiting challenged Yale captain William Arnold to a football match. It was a watershed moment for the sport.
So Yale played rugby, and Harvard, being a little more experienced, defeated Yale. I think that the 1875 was the first big game of American collegiate football.
In the stands in New Haven that day, witness to Harvard's 4-0 victory, was a 16-year-old student in his final year at Hopkins Grammar School in New Haven. The next fall, he would be a freshman at Yale, and he vowed he would help his team avenge that embarrassing defeat. For Yale and the game of college football, Walter Chauncey Camp would accomplish that task and a whole lot more. Thirteen men comprised the 1876 Yale squad. 2 were freshmen. 1 was Walter Camp. It would be the start of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American sport. As a player, he participated in 32 games and tasted defeat just once. As a junior, he was captain. As a senior, coach. It was the beginning of a love affair with the sport he shaped.
Walter Camp, the coach at Yale, is the most important single figure in sport in the late 19th century. He gives a rationale for football. Football will teach these men self-discipline, not as wasting their lives, not as being useless, but as learning the importance of time discipline.
The father of American football originally intended to become a doctor, remaining at Yale for 3 years in medical school until he realized he couldn't stand the sight of blood. As captain and coach of the nation's best team, Camp quickly became the preeminent voice for the sport. Unsatisfied with the nature of the game, Camp sought to refine it.
Rugby has a scrum. The ball would be thrown into this gaggle of players, and they would try to heel it out to their team. Walter Camp had a very systematic mind. He didn't like this haphazard way of possession, and so he suggested that the ball carrier, when he was tackled, would retain possession.
Camp changed rugby's scrummage to football's scrimmage. On paper, the difference is 1 letter. On the field, it was revolutionary. The ball would be set in play, snapped back, at first by foot and later by hand. It introduced the concepts of the offense and the defense, and the element of strategy. But problems quickly arose.
When they had the ball, if they just hung on to it and didn't give it up, the worst they could do is tie. And strangely enough, the fans found it kind of boring. So in 1882, Walter Camp came up with another rule.
That year, Camp introduced the concept of yards and downs. His vision laid the framework for the game of modern American football. It was time to showcase his sport across the country.
He got a letter from a small school in Indiana back in 1892 asking them if they would teach him how to play the game of football.
The letter stated, "Will you kindly furnish me with some points on the best way to develop a good football team? Knowing that you are an authority on the game, I would welcome any points you might give me." But Camp remained closest to Yale. As an unpaid coach and overall academic advisor, Camp saw his team flourish, mastering the game he had, in essence, developed. Yale would become the dominant football force in the country. In the 1880s and 90s, Princeton and Harvard joined Yale as the nation's dominant teams. Together, the Big Three controlled the sport.
If you just think about it, it's very strange that this game played at a handful of elite universities in the Northeast would become, a popular spectacle played around the country. And the explanation for this is the power of the popular press.
Newspapers, starved for sports coverage in the fall after the baseball and horse racing seasons, turned to Camp's beloved football. The big media event, a Thanksgiving championship game held in New York between the best of the Big Three. It was the 19th century's Super Bowl.
The attendance at these games increases from about 5,000 in 1880 to 50,000 by the early 90s. People who have never had anything to do with any of these colleges are suddenly really interested in this game as a spectacle and as a social phenomenon.
Capitalizing on the attention and profits, the father of American football turned from on-field innovator to marketer. In 1889, Camp introduced the concept of the All-American team, creating the first known stars in the game.
You go to the College Football Hall of Fame and you'll see everybody's in there. It's Walter Camp's All-American team. And when you walk down the halls, that's all you see is Walter Camp.
Camp would stay active in football throughout his life, promoting the game's inherent values off the field and devising strategy on it.
I think war, industrial competition, survival of the fittest, they all come together for Walter Camp, and football exemplifies all three, and to him is the greatest thing ever.
In the early 1890s, a remarkable phenomenon took place. That is, almost every school with any male player suddenly was playing football.
The game spread from its center, New Haven. Yale football graduates became missionary coaches, espousing the benefits of football to students across the nation.
As the game became popularized and schools around the country wanted to play, they had to have somebody teach them the game. More often than not, it was a Yale alumnus who happened to be in the area, or perhaps, was hired to come out.
Yale in the early days was very much the cradle of coaches, and probably about 15 schools got their very first coaches from Yale.
One of the members of Yale's championship 1888 team was a pious, clean-cut student whose athletic ability was matched by a driving ambition. As a Yale divinity student, Amos Alonzo Stagg played football, making Walter Camp's first All-American team. Stagg was perhaps a greater talent at baseball, but he viewed that sport as too vice-ridden. So instead of a potential career at the Boston Red Sox, he planned to become a minister.
And then the Lord spoke to him. Now, when the Lord speaks to you, he doesn't talk to you. Thoughts come into your head. And the thought came in that he could serve his master by being a football coach.
After graduating from Yale, Stagg accepted a coaching position in 1892 at the new University of Chicago.
It was Stagg who carried that gospel to the Midwest. In fact, during the time that he took that gridiron message west, the newspapers very openly and literally called him the football missionary, and the gospel of the gridiron comes to Chicago. Even the Canadian papers had stories about Stagg's going west to take football to the savages.
Stagg not only brought the game to Chicago and the Midwest, but he was a brilliant football mind. He was an innovator.
He put the quarterback behind center. He also brought in the man in motion. He brought in wind sprints. He innovated the Letterman's Club. He innovated the playbook.
He had the first athletic dorm to keep the football players together, and they had to sign a pledge. No drinking, smoking, or gambling if they stayed in the athletic dorm.
He has innovated just about everything that's involved with football.
In 1894, Stagg established another college football milestone. With his mentor, Walter Camp, now coaching at Stanford, Stagg and Herbert Hoover, the Stanford student manager, arranged a game. Armed with a Pullman train car, he and his Chicago boys hit the road, bound for the West Coast. The intercollegiate game finally reached the Pacific Coast.
Think of this. Chicago and Stanford play a game of football at the New Year in the sunshine of Southern California, far from either campus, for no ostensible educational reason, only for the gate receipts and the publicity. In short, the bowl concept was established.
While the North fine-tuned the game of football, The South was recovering from the ravages of the Civil War. Southern schools lagged behind other regions in developing the game. But in 1899, Sewanee, a tiny Episcopal college of 300 students in the mountains of Tennessee, captured the imaginations of the football world. The 1899 Sewanee team opened its season with 4 wins, outscoring opponents like Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Tennessee by an average of 36-0. The squad then embarked on the most ambitious road trip to date.
They went on the road, 2,500-mile trip.
Sewanee traveled to Texas and won. Then 3 wins in the next 3 days at Houston, Texas A&M, and Tulane. They rested on the Sabbath, then beat LSU and Ole Miss.
5 big victories in 6 days, all shutouts.
We're talking about sturdy old country boys that saw it as a great adventure. I think if you had to rank the teams of the South from day one, that you would have to rank the 1899 Sewanee team as the greatest team of the Southern football history.
By the turn of the 20th century, the game was being played nationwide across all regions of the country. However, West Coast football lacked recognition. The turning point came in 1902. The Tournament of Roses in Pasadena, California, decided to schedule a football game. Michigan, the dominant team of the Midwest and perhaps the nation, was invited to face Stanford, the West Coast best team. By the third quarter, Michigan led 49-0, and Stanford asked the Wolverines to halt the contest. Though the first Rose Bowl never made it past the third quarter, West Coast fans marveled at the potential of the game, as demonstrated in devastating fashion by Michigan.
Michigan really opened the eyes of the nation. They really brought to light the fact that people loved football and that it was becoming a national pastime, and that it wasn't just for the East Coast, it was for the Midwest and it was for California. It was a national game now.
Since 1875, the year Harvard introduced Yale to the rugby game, until 1894, the Crimson claimed victory only once against their arch rival. Many thought 1894 was Harvard's best chance to get revenge. The rivalry reached a fever pitch when the 2 teams met on a neutral field in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Policemen marching 2 abreast because Springfield was a small town and they needed the Boston police to keep order. Finally, the gates opened and people rushed in, and they even were kicking over baskets of hot dogs. Evangelist is alongside and he's saying, "Repent or be saved." And of course, nobody is paying any attention to him.
The atmosphere before the game had the feel of an impending battle. The game itself was a war. By the end of the game, 1/4 of the players were so badly injured they could not return. Yale captain Frank Hinkey, known as a ruthless player, further inflamed the situation with a late hit, breaking his opponent's collarbone. Shortly after, another Harvard player, Murphy, suffered a head injury, yet remained in the game.
People didn't realize what concussions were unless the player was out cold and practically dying on the field. So here was Murphy wandering around and being pointed in the right direction. And finally, they took him out and they laid him out, and he looked like he was dead. Actually, Murphy was not dead.
Yale won the battle that day, but the game of football suffered. The violence appalled those in attendance, and more importantly, those covering the game for the newspapers.
A newspaper in Germany somehow got wind of this and wrote an article about ambulances pulling up to the scene and bodies being carted away. It was almost sound like something like a miniature battle of Gettysburg.
Yale and Harvard would not meet again until 1897. The game itself was at fault. There was no forward pass to spread players around the field. A mass momentum play, called the wedge, or V-trick for its shape, was a dominant strategy, where the ball carrier was protected by a front line of teammates.
It was unbelievably violent. The maimings and even deaths, were really shocking.
It was mass brutality. There was no headgear. There was no protection. There was what they called push and pull football, where the ball carrier would get catapulted through the line of scrimmage. And these players were wearing leather vests that had been stitched together in the front. Well, some would have handles sewn on the back, so they would grab them on the back and hurl them across the line of scrimmage.
Players of the era were not content with merely winning. The goal was total annihilation of the opposing team.
Frederick Remington would take his jersey down to a local slaughterhouse and have it dipped in blood, in his words, to make it more businesslike.
Just after the turn of the century, American college students are routinely dying on college football fields, and it creates a controversy. Should the game continue? Roosevelt, as president, was very interested in the ability of American males to show their manliness, their courage, their fortitude through sports.
Theodore Roosevelt was an avid football fan, declaring, "I would rather see my boys play it than see them play any other." However, the escalation of the violence and the game's unsportsmanlike conduct concerned him. In 1905, the president turned his attention to cleaning up the game of football. In October of that year, 2 days after the first games of the season, Roosevelt summoned a conference of football leaders, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and called for reform. It was the first time an acting president invited a sports delegation to the White House.
Certainly, Roosevelt's intervention was important, not only in giving the public a sense that things will be taken care of, but also the idea of the president, in effect, having an interest in sport.
The meeting in itself did not accomplish much. The game continued to be violent. Roosevelt's own son broke his nose in a game that season. In all, 18 men died playing college football in 1905. But it was a death in New York, in a game between Union College and New York University that spurred reform.
The most outstanding Union player, Harold Moore, dived into a play probably without a helmet. His head hit a knee and suffered a concussion. And immediately, they drove him as quickly as they could to Fordham Hospital, which was nearby. 2 hours later, he was dead.
NYU's Chancellor, Henry McCracken, called a conference in New York. In December 1905, 62 schools attended and discussed how to reform their violent sport. One new rule came from Amos Alonzo Stagg, a former baseball pitcher. Stagg, years before, had suggested legalizing a forward pass to open up the game. In 1905, it was resurrected and adopted.
What most people don't realize is that the forward pass was designed to get the ball away from the center of the field where it was thought injuries would not occur.
The legalization of the forward pass did have an immediate impact. Intriguing, though seldom used, the pass opened the game a bit. In 1907, the number of deaths decreased, but there were too many restrictions to make it widespread. It would take nearly 3 more years of debates and meetings to ultimately alleviate the violence and open the game.
Even Walter Camp came around and said, "Hey, this is okay. Let's take the restrictions off." You could throw the ball across the goal line, hence They reduced the size of the field to 100 yards and created the end zone.
Schools in the East were still reluctant to use the pass. That was soon to change. In 1913, powerhouse Army was looking for a filler game before its annual clash with Navy. That same year, a small Midwestern Catholic school named Notre Dame hired a disciple of Amos Alonzo Stagg. Jess Harper became its head football coach. Army gave Harper's Notre Dame team its free date, November 1st. Notre Dame's quarterback was 145-pound Gus Doré. His prime target was Newt Rockne. College football would never be the same.
Dad was up there in the spring and got Doré and Rockne to go to the beach where they were lifeguards so that Rockne could learn to catch the ball running full belt over his shoulder like this. And that's what changed the passing in football, catching the ball on the dead run.
Armed with the forward pass, the Ramblers of Notre Dame, as they were then called, marched to West Point and stunned the crowd. In the first half, both teams used the pass conservatively, and at halftime, the game was close. The underdog visitors led 14-13. In the third quarter, Doré and Rockne drew on those summertime beach sessions to upend the football world.
Nobody had ever defended against a bomb before, and they defeated Army 35-13, and the football world was just stunned, shocked. You know, it was just utter inversion of the order of nature. The first long bomb, Newt Rockne pretended that he'd pulled a muscle or something, and he's limping, and then the defender leaves him alone and goes after somebody else. All of a sudden, Rockne, runs down the field about 30-35 yards, and he catches an easy pass, and it's totally in the open, and that's the first bomb, but then there are 4 others.
It said that the Army supporters would applaud on some of the passes. They were so beautifully done.
Now convinced of the effectiveness of the forward pass, schools throughout the East embraced that strategy, much to the delight of a growing fan base. College football had survived its crisis of violence. The game had evolved. Now the American public was fully ready to embrace it. By 1915, Europe was steeped in trench warfare. World War I, the war to end all wars, had yet to involve the United States. But Americans were aware of the horrors of battle. With the European war as a backdrop, college football was viewed on a different scale. The game had taken on a mantle of respectability. Newspapers, once critical of the game's violence, now lauded its healthy, competitive spirit. By 1917, the U.S. entered the fray. American college campuses emptied as military-age students entered the war. But the war's effects ran deeper.
The two sports that benefited most from World War I were very clearly boxing and football, because there is a violent nature to both of them. And I think in the military mind, this has some payoff on the battlefield. And analogies would come from this. The long bomb, getting over the goal line, making the big march.
Soldiers on Army bases were taught how to play football, or taught how to watch other people playing football. And the idea that football was not only recreational and entertaining and so on, but also, helped build soldiers. The other thing that happened in the First World War, there was an appallingly high percentage of American men who were unfit for the war. After the war, there was a real heightened sensitivity to the need to create a more physically fit American population. And football and other school sports were going to be one of the main ways that that could be done.
In 1919, with the war over, thousands of college-age men were heading back to school with an understanding and an appreciation of football. The game's rules had changed, and now to accommodate demand, its infrastructure was ready for improvement. In 1914, Yale, with $1 out of every $8 of school revenue generated by football, opened the Yale Bowl. It was not the first football stadium, but the Yale Bowl was the first of its kind, literally dug out of the ground. The bowl became the standard for football stadiums with a capacity of 70,000. Other schools, seeing their own attendance increase, began to build their own massive stadiums in the 1920s, many as memorials to those who perished in the First World War. Americans tired of war were ready for leisure and spent their Saturday afternoons watching their modern-day gladiators in the gigantic bowl-structured stadiums. A new set of heroes graced the land. In the country's heartland, the first true college football superstar emerged. Hailing from Wheaton, Illinois, Harold Red Grange became an American icon, a product of his times.
He benefited from a lot of forces that were unleashed in the 1920s, the building of these great stadiums. The Memorial Stadium at Illinois, the Rose Bowl, the Los Angeles Coliseum. By the 1920s, you have huge amounts of people who are taking their automobiles from Chicago, from Western Illinois, from St. Louis in some cases, and making an outing for the weekend.
The press was the chief medium that helped familiarize Grange to a new, hungry audience. But radio burst onto the scene as well.
And it's 4th down, 5 to go for a touchdown.
And newsreels shown before movies exposed his skills to thousands of Americans who never would have otherwise seen him perform.
Some people think the flickering of these pictures, that is, the speed of them, are a little bit too fast for reality. Gave Grange kind of almost a mystical impact on people, that he moved in almost a ghost-like way, and of course the name that was finally given to him, the Galloping Ghost.
Red Grange was the first true football celebrity player. There had been a lot of famous players before him, but Grange was the first true celebrity.
In 1923, the Galloping Ghost debuted for the University of Illinois. He scored 3 times in 39 minutes. But stardom is 1 part skill and 2 parts good fortune. Grange rose to the occasion at the right times. His 2 parts good fortune came a year later and created a legend.
It was homecoming. It was the dedication of the stadium. Ordinarily, for an Illinois game, the Eastern newspapers would cover it with maybe about 2 inches of space. But this particular game, because it was all those things, they put it on the front page of the sports page. So Grange, if he was going to have a great game, this was the one.
Against the top-ranked Michigan team, a squad that had not lost since 1921, the Wheaton Iceman scored 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes, more than all of Michigan's opponents combined over the previous 3 seasons. However, many of the nation's leading sports writers were in New York attending an Army-Notre Dame contest. The next season, Grange played his first game in the East against one of its dominant teams, the University of Pennsylvania. The sports writers didn't miss this one.
Grange comes in and he has another tremendous game. 3 touchdowns, he runs wild. Grange becomes a phenomenon. And the disbelievers, now they're twice believers because they realize they had made a mistake, so they're going to build him up even more so.
Grange's appeal transcended the playing field. It struck a chord with Americans from all backgrounds.
He was seen as somebody who was coming from the countryside in a decade where things were becoming more and more urbanized and industrialized. So he was kind of the image of the common man.
The Galloping Ghost left Illinois the day after his final game in 1925 and turned professional. But his impact on the college game transcended his professional career.
He meant college football in the 1920s to many people. Into the 1930s, a football program was saying, well, if we could just recruit that one athlete and we could get a Grange here, we could be a success.
October 18, 1924, was the day Grange personally annihilated Michigan. But that day, the attention of the nation was in New York, where sports writer Grantland Rice was watching Army take on Newt Rockne's Fighting Irish.
That's the day Notre Dame beat Army 13-7, and the Four Horsemen became the most famous quartet of the 20th century, and I include the Beatles.
Grantland Rice's lead-in following that game, comparing the impact of those four players to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, created an instant legend to a program that was quickly becoming a national treasure. If Red Grange was the first football superstar, Notre Dame was the first superstar program. Both were crucial to the explosion of the game's popularity in the 1920s. But for Notre Dame, the path was much more difficult. In 1842, a French priest, Father Sorin, was given a tract of land near South Bend, Indiana, to start a school, mainly to serve as a preparatory institution. The school was Notre Dame, and into the early 20th century, it was forced to exist in a hostile environment.
The Klan ran the state, essentially. There was, in 1924, a very famous incident where the Klan held a huge clavern, as they called it, in South Bend, and the plan was to march on Notre Dame. The Notre Dame students came out and fought the Klan and fought the police and beat them up, essentially.
It was against this backdrop that Notre Dame built a football program. Spurred by its groundbreaking win over Army in 1913, Notre Dame began to make a name for itself. 5 years later, their star in that game, Newt Rockne, became head coach. By the end of Rockne's career, the school could claim the most popular, most recognizable college football program in the nation, especially with the immigrant community.
Ethnic Americans felt in many ways they were disenfranchised, and America wanted them to be losers, but here comes Notre Dame, and they're winning.
On the basis of religion, Notre Dame was outside the mainstream college football world in the Midwest. A Roman Catholic school, it was shunned by the Big Nine, later known as the Big Ten. Ironically, the forces that conspired against Rockne and Notre Dame in the late 1910s and early 20s only made the coach and the team stronger, more popular, and more determined.
Cronin! Comidio! All right, come on, baby! Get up, come on!
Armed with society's rejected immigrant Catholics and some Jews, Rockne took his band of cast-offs on the road. He had no other choice.
They became Catholic America's team. They became Immigrant America's team. You know, they encountered a lot of bigotry, you know, and resistance at a time when almost everyone else was playing most of their games within their own regions and belonged to conferences.
One of the most important games in Notre Dame's history occurred in 1923. The Irish traveled to New Jersey to face Princeton. Notre Dame won 25-2, beating one of the East's dominant teams.
This was a huge kind of morale booster for Catholics on the East Coast, for many ordinary Americans, not simply Catholics, who never really dreamed of going to college. Suddenly, they became fans of Notre Dame and therefore became interested in college football.
Rockne, realizing the marketing and publicity potential, continued to parade his team across the country, beating heavily Protestant schools in the North like Princeton and Southern schools like Georgia Tech. He went out west to face USC, beginning the first truly intersectional rivalry. However, the true breakthrough for the Irish was a game against Army in 1924. The game the Four Horsemen were born. Notre Dame upset the Cadets 13-7 and accepted a bid to the Rose Bowl. Rockne, always the showman, displayed his marketing genius.
It's the only time it's ever played in the Rose Bowl, and it doesn't simply go directly to Pasadena. It takes this kind of religious pilgrimage.
The pilgrimage stopped in places as near to South Bend as Chicago and as far as Tucson. But once they arrived in Los Angeles, Rockne's team focused on the game. The Irish beat Stanford in the Rose Bowl, and the celebration grew. The pilgrimage continued.
They don't get back to Notre Dame until well into January. And what happened was fans across America saw Notre Dame and identified with Notre Dame, and even as important, sports editors and such decided that Notre Dame football was a major story.
Rockne's savvy worked in conjunction with a receptive press that first took notice and then glorified the underdog Irish. Together, they helped create the nation's first celebrity program.
Notre Dame football became as important to this country as New York Yankee baseball. And it became synonymous with winning. And it really, at that point, it really broke out of its ethnic, class, and other backgrounds.
And Notre Dame, along with the game's first celebrity superstar, Red Grange, solidified college football's place in American society. Hundreds of thousands flocked to see the game, and millions more read about their heroes in the Sunday morning papers. By the end of the 1920s, the game was strong. The country was not. As America headed into the 1930s, the nation plunged into depression. However, the appetite for escape only increased. Radio and movies boomed. The radio's impact on American life and sport was immense. Now football fans could follow their teams at home and on the road. Another medium also had a large impact on the game. The newsreels, clips of Americana shown before movies.
And the Yankee Stadium crowd settles back for a thriller. Army's ball, Kenna gets hold of it and sends it on its way to Hall, who snakes along for 15 yards.
Newsreels captured the pageantry of football, the bands and the cheerleaders and the card sections and all that stuff, because they were visually so interesting. Football became not just an aspect of American leisure life, but a real part of American life more generally.
Football's popularity continued to grow, but it adapted to the times. No longer could fans support teams at the gate like they could in the 1920s. Entrepreneurs searched for new ways to draw crowds to marquee games, especially in the Depression-plagued South. Emulating the Rose Bowl, bowl games cropped up in major cities like Miami, Dallas, and New Orleans.
A lot of this was simply to draw in tourists and revenue. It was an extension of the intersectional game, which had been so popular in the 1920s.
New bowl games had another effect. These games, in which the best schools from the North competed against those from the South, provided entertainment for an otherwise depression-ravaged South.
It was a way for them to uphold the things that they believed in the South and represented against some other national powerhouse. You know, people listening on radios from Alabama to Louisiana or Tennessee of what was played in the Cotton Bowl or what was played in the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl. To be able to sit down maybe at a local store and have a soft drink and listen to a football game on radio, it gave you that little bit of inspiration to go into the next week.
As the calendar turned to December 1941, college football had completed its most successful season to date. But as the winds of war were again brewing, college football would face yet another hurdle, and this one would affect the framework of the game for the next 30 years.